Welcome to SEC Football Live. My name is Braden Gall, and my esteemed and wonderful guest today on the show, Seth Emerson from The Athletic, covering all things Georgia Bulldogs, the SEC, National College Football, name, image, and likeness, probably Congress as well. Is that everything, Seth?
I've not been to Congress. I've been to the White House.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Related. Yeah.
That's right. The profile picture. So thank you guys all for hanging out. If you want to jump into the comments and ask Seth some questions, we do appreciate you guys there. Please share the product. Of course, you got the like button on the YouTube page. Share it on Facebook, Twitter, etc., wherever you are watching. So we're going to cover all things Georgia Bulldogs, spring practice, Kirby Smart, the evolution of Carson Beck. But also we're going to look at NIL in the SEC and some of the hot seat talk that's going around this conference as well. If you're okay with a rapid-fire, up-tempo offense, which, of course, Georgia Bulldogs fans are getting used to, of course.
Yeah, they've been that for a while. Just kind of, they've been that for a while. I think they're finally becoming known. Georgia is, as they are not your grandfather's Kirby Smart, boring offense team. They've not since Todd Monken got here. They've shed that.
Well, if you care about all the things I just said, which I'm assuming if you're watching or listening on the podcast, you do, make sure you go to The Athletic, subscribe, pay for good journalism. It doesn't cost a whole lot. It's absolutely worth your time, especially if you're a college football fan. You guys have an enormous staff. You guys do great jobs. So everybody go check them out. And, of course, support good reporters doing the work. We'll get to Carson Beck and his Lamborghini and the fact that you could probably win a big bar bet with the idea that he was third in the nation and number one in the SEC in passing yards last year.
Yeah.
I think you could win a lot of money at your local drinking establishment. I just want to get your quick thoughts on spring practice as Georgia wraps up. In general, what is it that you learn about spring ball? What is it that anyone can learn versus maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago? Like how different is this part of the sports calendar now?
10 years ago, every team had like 3 or 4 freshmen early enroll, and the transfer portal didn't exist. Now it seems like the entire class early enrolls. A few don't, but it's the majority. And then you have transfers. Like all but one of the 7 transfers that Georgia's getting are here. So you get a better idea of what the team's going to look like, but you're still limited because a lot of players take spring off, especially at a program like Georgia that's kind of been there, done that. They're gonna let guys like get surgery after the season, like a labrum surgery, or if they had a nagging foot issue or something like that, they're gonna say, go ahead and get it now and skip spring. So it's an incomplete version. I think you learn you learn a little bit more about the depth chart. You have a guy that may emerge a little bit. You adjust your expectations on some guys, but I don't know that you come away like I don't know that anybody's top 25 that they released after, let's say, mid-January, when you've had the smoke from the portal clear and draft declarations. I don't know that it needs to look that much different.
Yeah.
Than if you did it again after everyone's spring practice, barring off-field news. When, the portal opens up again after the spring. So,
hooray.
Yeah.
Well, Damian Martinez, really, really good running back out of Oregon State, has already acknowledged he's going to do it. I'm curious what the movement looks like, but I'll ask you about Kirby's strategy around that and sort of the SEC strategy around that in just a second. Carson Beck, of course, this is a guy who led the SEC in passing last year. You and I have talked for years now about the Georgia's offense evolution. It's sort of already happened, to your point earlier that you've already mentioned. But this group, it's changed coordinators, it's changed quarterbacks, the receivers change, the offensive linemen change, the running backs change, and it just keeps getting better. Is this going to be the best version of what Kirby Smart wants on that side of the ball in 2024? Is that a fair expectation for Carson Beck?
Maybe. The 2022 offense was really good. They won a championship mainly with that offense. The defense was solid, was pretty good that year, but the offense was the strength. That was the third year of Stetson Bennett as the starter, the second full year, and his first time being the starter the whole way through. Yeah. This is Carson Beck's second full year as starter, but 5th year on campus. And he's going to have a lot of weapons around him. The question's going to be the running game. But even then, Georgia's offensive line should be very, very good. And it's already been very good. Like they were a Joe Moore finalist the last few years, and they have kind of a chip on their shoulder. Sorry to use the cliche about not ever winning it. And this year's unit might be good enough to win it. So they might block well enough that like you and I could run for good 700, 800 clip there. And yeah, but Carson Beck should have a really diverse array of receivers and tight ends to throw to, even without Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. Yeah, I mean, it's a measure of how Kirby Smart has built this offense up, that they may have 3 first-round picks this year, as in the draft later this month. In definitely Brock Bowers, sounds like definitely Amarius Mims, and Ladd McConkey could sneak in to the end of the first round. And yet their offense could actually be better. But the offense has to be better because the schedule is going to be tougher. And when they faced the best team they had faced last year against Alabama, yeah, the offense did not measure up. Not that I think they were beating up on bad teams and adding their stats or whatever. It was just, that was Bowers, McConkey were both hobbled. Ra Thomas wasn't playing. He's a guy who could be key on this year's offense. But they opened with Clemson, and then 2 weeks later, Kentucky, and then 2 weeks after that, Alabama on the road, Texas in mid-October, Ole Miss in November, all on the road. So, yeah, it's a tough schedule this year, and their offense is going to need to be really good.
Well, I want to ask you about the defense, but look, this is the number 1 team in the country. To your point about the preseason polls in January, in March, and when our Athlon magazine comes out, it's still going to be number 1. I'm not trying to break any news here, but like they're the number 1 team. They're the most complete team. They have the most stability from a coaching staff to quarterback through depth chart, etc. Defensively, though, again, we're talking about the number 1 team in the nation here, so we have to sort of it's a clear our throat kind of conversation. Depth chart wise, let's just say I don't want to go 1 to like 85 or even 1 to 42 or whatever, but like of the 22 guys that are going to play a lot or the 25 guys that are going to play a lot, how is this unit talent and experience wise relative to even the defense last year versus the defense that was historically good in 21?
Well, the 21 defense will probably never be replicated in terms of like how much pure talent is on there. The way they've recruited is the same. So there might be, like, if you go to that 24/7 or whatever you use, On3 industry, like pure talent database or whatever, might be as much on this year's defense as there was in 21 and 22. However, not as much up front. You saw that last year without Jalen Carter. The first year, they did not have Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis or Devontae Wyatt, Trayvon Walker. Those 3 guys, the last 3 guys had left after the 22 season. Jalen Carter was the only one back last year, or 2 years for the 22 season. Sorry. 23 was the first year they didn't have any of those guys, and the D-line wasn't as good. And their run defense, it's an amazing stat. Their run defense ranked in the top 3 nationally every year from 2019 to 22, as measured by average yards per carry by the opponent. Top 3, not in the SEC, in the country. Then last year they dipped to like the 30s. Now that's not all about the D-line. It's about the guys behind them sometimes, but they've tinkered there. They kind of let Jamon Dumas-Johnson go to Kentucky because they had some other guys at inside linebacker that they thought might be, they're younger, but a little more upside. They've moved Michael Williams from defensive end to outside linebacker to see if he can kind of do for them what Nolan Smith did for the 21 and 22 teams. Is people think of edge as like sack specialist, but in Georgia's defense, it's almost as important, probably arguably more important for run defense.
Yeah.
So they're doing a lot of tweaking in the front to get better against the run. They lose 3 of their 5 starters in the secondary, but they've got young, very good players, 2 5-star freshmen, and KJ Bolden and Alice Robinson. How quickly they play, I don't know, but my attitude on college football secondaries is they can be really good, but they can give up a lot of points because that's just what happens in college football these days is you play offenses that throw the ball a lot. The key is how you protect them with a pass rush and stopping the run so you can just say so you can key on their passing offense.
Is it safe to say, and I feel like I've asked you this question every year, like if they're not the champion, because if you want to boil all of 2023 down to a single thing, like I still would argue they were one of the two best teams in the country, if not the best team. And I think they would have beaten Texas or Washington in a playoff game. I think they would have beaten Alabama in a rematch. I don't know what they would have done against Michigan. That was a really special collection of Michigan players.
They would have beaten Michigan. But it would have been Texas.
Oh, Texas! Come on.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is, if you want to boil down why they didn't play in the playoff or why they weren't in the national championship game, you could say the front seven didn't get stops against Jalen Milroe in the second half when it needed to.
Yes.
For whatever reason. He used his legs on a few plays. He was using the short passing game on a few plays. Carson Beck did his job in that game. He continued to lead them down the field for most of that game. When they needed a score, down 2, he'd get them a score. They couldn't get the stop. Is that the thing?
Run the ball.
Yeah, also true. True. Would you say that is still, like, if this team doesn't accomplish its goal of national championship or SEC championship or whatever, schedule's much more difficult. But does it come down to what you just were talking about, the front seven and then those key spots, not stopping an elite quarterback?
I think so. I think entering last year, I would get this question all the time, like what could possibly keep them from three-peating? And the three things I always said was run defense, whether Carson Beck was ready for this role, and whether there was any complacency that kind of resulted from the schedule. They got through the schedule 12-0. I think they kind of played with their food a lot early on. I think they're going to be helped this year by opening with Clemson and just knowing the brutal schedule they have the whole way through. That's probably making their offseason workouts a little better. And Carson Beck wasn't the problem last year, even in the SEC championship, that they couldn't run the ball. But the run defense was still a thing, was still a problem. The defense overall, stopping Milroe, and, being able – what I said about secondaries, it's kind of the same thing when you're facing a running quarterback, like a dual threat quarterback. Like, he's going to get his. Yeah. Like, he just is. And it kind of got back to, like, Georgia's offense needed to outscore Alabama there. Like, that was a game where Alabama was going to score 24 or so points, and Georgia's offense failed in its job, what it had done during the regular season too. It was a team loss. But when I look for this year, I do get back to, like, the front seven. Do they get enough pass pressure, and do they improve the run defense over last year? But they shouldn't have to get back to like 2021 or even 2022 form, because the offense should be good enough to carry them if the running offense is there and if the passing offense performs as expected. The running offense just needs to, like I said, the O-line should be really good. The question is the actual running backs, because they've got some health issues there. They brought in Trevor Etienne. I think he'll be suspended for a game or two for the DUI arrest. I don't know if it'll be the Clemson game. But yeah, I think if they're the way a Kirby Smart team is built, if that passing offense is as good, consistent. Like, now in the 12-team playoff, they don't have to go 12-0. They don't even have to go 11-1 with Georgia's schedule. But if that offense can be as good as it can be all year, I think they're playing in Atlanta.
There's like a 0%. There's like a 0%
the national championship, not the SEC championship.
Yeah. There's like a 0% chance they miss the playoff, I feel like, even with the brutal schedule, because you'd have to be 10-2, and I still think you get in at 10-2. So I want to transition to some of the stuff you are covering as well as Georgia, which is sort of the NIL space and all this other stuff. But I want to use it. I want to look at it through the lens of Kirby Smart first, which is how has he, like, all these things we talk about, transfer portal, NIL collectives, depth charts in spring practice, like all these stuff that we talk about. How has Kirby specifically evolved over the last few years? We've seen Dabo at Clemson refuse to evolve, for example. How has Kirby Smart evolved in these areas? And that will sort of catapult us into a conversation about what the future of NIL looks like in the SEC. But how has he changed in his approach to roster management?
Well, he's like Nick Saban. He's like his mentor. Like they adapt, they evolve, they understand adapt or die. Like they have strong philosophies, but they don't like cling to them at the expense of progress and change the way like Adabo did, and some other coaches probably have. They've adapted, especially on the portal front, but it's now connected to NIL, and Georgia's had a little bit of a kind of a off field kind of push for fans for NIL money, but they still had the number one recruiting class in the country this past year. They probably, NIL probably cost them maybe a recruit, maybe a transfer, guy that went somewhere else when people thought he was going to go to Georgia from Alabama, for instance. But they've largely, you look at their roster and they've largely been able to hold it intact. We'll see if after the spring window they lose anybody. I mean, it's a changing world, but they've adapted. They've done what they need to do. And Kirby Smart and the athletic director, Josh Brooks, they're both of that. Like they're both pragmatic. They both have their, finger to the wind. They know the way things are going and they're able to adapt and evolve. They certainly wish certain things were different, but they understand that right now, certain things are not.
Where is Georgia? You said in your story, great story, by the way, up on The Athletic. Make sure you go check it out. All about NIL and sort of donor fatigue, which is very, very, I think it's a perfect phrase for what we're talking about here. I've got a couple of questions about that. But in the story, you were talking to some folks, and it sounds like roughly 15 schools are at $10 million a year for their roster through NIL. And I'm curious, we've seen lots of different programs in the SEC sort of rev the engine at different rates on NIL for a variety of reasons. Alabama was a little slower, Texas A&M and Texas a lot faster. You sort of do allude to the desperation being a factor in why some of these things have happened. State legislation is a factor in all of this as well. So number one, where is Georgia relative to the rest of its top flight competition in the SEC? And then I want to get to what do we think happens here as it evolves. But tell me where Georgia's at, and are they at the top of the conference in terms of how sophisticated their operation is, and who is doing it the best in the SEC?
I think Ole Miss would be the one that most people would tell you in the SEC is doing it the best. Texas, but what do these programs have in common? They're more desperate than the Georgias and the Alabamas, and that kind of gets to donor fatigue. But like, it is a national problem. It's a national issue, but it's at Alabama and Georgia, it's like donor skepticism, as in, we still have the number one recruiting class. We still have the number two recruiting class. Why do you need my NIL money? Yeah. And there's a little bit of a kickstart for Georgia when it loses a certain transfer or loses on, a guy to the portal or loses a certain quarterback or key recruit at the last second. But is it enough? I think it gets back to like the desperation thing. Like why did Texas A&M have that one really good recruiting class? It was desperation. Why did Ohio State get a lot of money? Well, not money, but get a lot of transfers and probably connected to, because of watching Michigan.
They accelerated.
Losing to Michigan three times in a row. And Ohio State was already a really good recruiting program, but they kicked it into gear in the portal. Georgia's just kind of there because they've adjusted to this new era, but they still had the number one recruiting class. And they've, after winning 2 national championships, they didn't win it last year, but they came really close again. They were 12-0, and it's not like they were skating by in all their games. Closest one was the Missouri game. Then maybe after that, South Carolina and Auburn. But they had a bad day against Alabama, and they also realized that if that had happened this year with a 12-team playoff, they would have been in the playoff, hosting a first-round game, and probably be a lot of people's pick to still win the championship. So there's not this desperation level at Georgia. If they don't win the championship again, depending on how this season plays out, then that desperation could kick back in. But of course, we don't know what the landscape's going to look like NIL portal rule wise come the end of this season.
Well, if when Seth takes off here in just a minute, a little shorter show today, I'll take some questions from you guys, and I'll sort of give you where I think this is all going to go. Not rocket science, but I have a pretty clear picture of this in terms of what I think is going to happen. Lack of panic is another phrase you use there for the lack of desperation in your article. I think that's a really important piece to note. I think it's not to use porn as an analogy here, Seth, but you sort of you know it when you
this one.
you know it when you see it, right? When Congress is asked what's porn, they go, well, you know it when you see it. And you can see Texas, you can see A&M, you can see Ole Miss, you can see Tennessee, you can see Missouri, Oregon, Ohio State, now ramping it up. Like, you know it when you see it. You're like, okay, they're doing a good job. The question I have for you to sort of predict the future is to these teams that have done this very well because they're desperate and they have the resources, what type of, when there is a new structure or a new system, whatever that may be, what is the adjustment going to be? Like, what is the actual thing that the coaches and the fans have to understand about that transition?
I don't know. I guess it's still hard to know what it's going to look like. I think the change that people are widely expecting and preparing for is revenue sharing, taking talk to ADs who are already like budgeting it for whether it's next year or 2 years, that there's like a certain amount, like 15 million, let's say, of their budget is going to be directly paying the players. But how exactly that looks, they're still trying to figure out. But that's the one thing they're looking at. I think the NIL and money is going to be a big part of it, but the programs that do have some stability with their coaching staff, that try to make their program a nice place to be, like just not,
right.
Yeah, that they're gonna. I mean, they're still gonna lose players, but maybe they're not gonna lose as many. It's those programs that it's just being able to adapt, being able to go with the times, and it'll be interesting to see how things go at Clemson, Georgia's first opponent this year, because if Dabo doesn't get it by now on the portal, he's never going to get it. It seems like he does kind of get it a little bit. He's going to have to adapt, and I think reality is setting in for coaches everywhere. It maybe has already set in. A lot of coaches are kind of pressuring their higher ups to be like, hey, if you need to do what you can to get this portal into, in some control, so we know what our roster looks like.
Yeah.
And if that means contracts, employees, CBA with a union, fine, do it. But obviously there's a lot of administrators who are like, oh, no.
Well, I'll let you go on this. And I know you and I talked about this, and I apologize for one more, but
sorry.
Is Georgia, like, I know Kirby's prepared for this. I think Kirby's good at, like you said, he's Nick Saban Jr. or now senior, and is capable of the evolution and seeing the things and around the curve and all that stuff. But we've talked a lot about why Georgia is so good at being as good as it is because sort of it's more stable at the top, and fans are more accustomed to sort of the slow cruise ship turn versus, the Ole Miss speedboat, for lack of a better analogy.
Yeah.
Is the higher ups, are they equipped, in your opinion, to handle that coming adjustment? Because that could be jarring for programs that like stability.
They will listen to Kirby. I do think that the higher ups, whether it's the school president or board of regents, governor, people that are involved, they're going to be the old school types that you'll probably run into in Augusta this weekend. They're like, I don't like change and NIL and shake your fist at a cloud and whatever. But if Kirby says, look, then they'll be like, okay, that's where Georgia's kind of well situated, is they've got a coach who has the credibility to go to them and tell them, we need this. I think the harder part is convincing the fan base. The fan base is all in on Kirby, but it's their wallets.
Yep.
So, it's not a sustainable model to every time you want a key recruit to be able to call up whatever country music singer you have on speed dial and say, we need this guy. You've got to have like consistent money going into the collective. And
I was walking outside that guy's bar a couple of nights ago, actually, here in Nashville.
Yeah.
It's very loud and obnoxious, but He's a big Georgia fan. So, Seth, thank you so much. I'm going to take some of your questions, and I've got the solution to all this. I'm going to present the exact solution to all of this stuff real succinctly here for you guys in just a second. So, Seth, make sure you go to The Athletic, pay for good journalism, of course. If you're a Georgia fan, SEC fan, college football fan, you want to know what's happening in the sport, Seth's your guy. So thank you so much, man, for giving us some time. We do appreciate you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Braden.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure. Seth Emerson, of course, covering the Georgia Bulldogs, but also now the SEC, as well as name, image, and likeness. So first of all, if you guys have questions, Bo, I know you're there, seeing you guys. I appreciate you guys hanging out. I'll take any questions you have if you want to. But I'm just going to tell you, this might sound like a broken record, but I'm just going to sort of lay it out for you, because this is to Seth's last point there. These athletic departments cannot operate on these razor-thin margins from a stability standpoint. You are dancing on the knife's edge, because the two phrases he used and we just talked about, donor fatigue and lack of panic. If your team isn't dedicated to winning, you're going to lose. The money will come in, and your Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Texas, you're going to generate a bunch of revenue. You're going to compete. You're going to get better. You're going to see results on the field. But the second you don't see results, which it might not be anybody's fault. It might be an injury. It might be the ball doesn't bounce your way. If all of a sudden, at the slightest problem or moment of adversity, we go to our boosters and we go to you, the middle class, or me, the fan, or you, the alumni, and say, look, we need more money because we lost that game or this game and we're 9-3 instead of 10-2. Donor fatigue is already here, folks. It's not going away. We as fans and you as fans should not be paying to upgrade the nickelback for your team in $1 billion a year sport. It's just not how it's going to work. So it's not that dancing on that razor's edge is not sustainable. So we are going to revenue sharing. What is going to happen? Here's what I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Number one, the NFL Players Association needs to have a minor league players association, right? You need to have who is good at negotiating on behalf of the players, who knows how to do it, who has the agents, who has the capacity to do this type of negotiation. You need a players association, but none of this NCAA garbage, because they don't know what they're doing. What they need is an NFLPA college division. And that group of people is going to be equipped to handle a negotiation that then will create a revenue sharing collectively bargained agreement between players and schools. And then you, the fans, are no longer going to be on the hook for upgrading, the left guard in the offseason. There has to be a revenue sharing agreement. And the schools that are equipped, and Seth already said it, there are some schools in the SEC that are already budgeting this stuff into their future plans. Those are the people that are going to be best equipped, because the desperate teams were best equipped to handle this change, right? If you look at Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Texas, what do they have in common? They haven't won shit in forever, and they got a ton of money. That's why those three programs got on the NIL so fast and probably pushed some boundaries when they did that. So teams with resources and desperation, well, how long does that last? They were best equipped to handle the new structure of the sport with NIL. Alabama took its time. Georgia took its time. Ohio State took its time. They wanted to see how it worked, and now they're sort of getting into it. But at the same time, it's about to change again. And it's all going to happen, I think, in 2028. Why do I think that? Well, that's where the language in the contracts for the television deals between the SEC, the Big Ten, the playoff, college football, ESPN, there's look-in language and there's expansion language. I think in 2028, we're going to see and then you also have the ACC lawsuits, of course, that are running parallel with all of this. Florida State and Clemson trying to sue the ACC to get out of the conference. Congress with NIL and labor relations. It's all going to work together. And in 2028, I'm willing to bet you we have more conference expansion with more teams coming into the SEC and into the Big Ten. We have a renegotiation of the television contract that includes collectively bargained revenue sharing agreement for the players. And you, the fans, no longer have to pay for the left tackle upgrade that your team needs. It is unfair to ask people that spend $3,000 or $4,000 a year on tickets, especially middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class fans that have been going to games for decades, generations. Grandpa used to sit up in those seats. It's unfair to ask you guys to do that. And so I think the solution is actually really simple. It's all the stuff I just laid out. It's simple to get it fixed. It's simple to get there. I don't know why it's going to take so long. The question is, and this is ultimately the most important part of this conversation, who is best equipped to handle that change when it happens? Now, I have it on good authority that one major athletic director, was at a state capitol building recently trying to figure out NIL stuff in his state. And that's the kind of conversations that are happening right now. That's just an anecdote. They're athletic directors who are budgeting properly, who are visiting with their state legislative offices and bodies, who know exactly what's going to happen with the TV contracts and the collectively bargained and the expansion coming. And I'm telling you, it's coming in 2028. Also, here's the great news. And I think this is lost in the conversation all the time. Nothing changes for you, the diehard SEC fan, on Saturdays. In fact, if you look at the schedule and you look at some games, especially for teams like Tennessee, LSU, Oklahoma, I would put Texas A&M into this conversation. Teams that are maybe on the outside looking into the playoff, those games are so much more important. In fact, I think the 12-team playoff is going to be a massive success. A massive success. You're going to have Tennessee versus Florida with potential playoff implications. Tennessee, Oklahoma with playoff implications early in the season. If Nico's not ready to go on the road and beat Oklahoma in Josh Heupel's return to Norman and they don't win that game, that could cost them a playoff spot. So I think the playoff and the expansion and your Saturday experience is actually going to be better. You're going to sit in the same seats, wear the same colors, sing the same fight song. You're going to walk through, at Neyland Stadium, you're going to piss in the same shitty troughs. Like, you're going to do all the fun stuff that you love about campus, about Saturdays, about being at a college football stadium, about being in the SEC. None of that's going to change. It doesn't matter if ESPN or the university or a business is paying your running back. What matters is that you're no longer paying the running back. You have been on the hook for too long, and donor fatigue and lack of panic is all a big part of all of this stuff. So I think it's going to be fixed pretty quickly, faster than people realize. And from what I understand, I think 2028 is exactly where I'm at. So special thanks to Seth Emerson for coming on. Do appreciate his time, of course. If you check us out on podcast form, please give us a review, 5 stars. If you're watching on Twitter or Facebook, do appreciate it. Share the product, tell somebody about it. And of course, if you're on YouTube, we got all kinds of great stuff. We got a Tennessee deep dive with Adam Sparks. I got a South Carolina deep dive with JC Sherbert. I got a Florida deep dive with David Waters, of course. We got LSU deep dive with T-Bob Hebert. We got all kinds of great guests, and we're going to be covering the SEC consistently over at Full 40 Sports on the YouTube page. So give us a subscription. We would really, really appreciate it. So with that being said, it's Masters Week, baby. It's golf season. My name is Braden Gall. You can get to me on twitter.com @Braden Gall. Otherwise, we'll talk to you guys next week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging out. See you later, guys.